If you love ghosts, cryptids, UFOs, and everything that goes bump in the night, then mark your calendars for the West Kentucky Paranormal Expo, happening September 26 in Mayfield, Kentucky at the Mayfield Graves County Fairgrounds. This incredible one-day event brings together some of the biggest names in the paranormal community, including Aaron G. Thompson from Netflix's 28 Days Haunted, Jimmy and Jeffrey from Outlaw Paranormal, The Wind of Rose, Josh Morris, Michael Huntington, Rachel Ravensville, and many, many more special guests and speakers. Your admission is just $15, and that gets you an all-day come-and-go wristband so you can explore at your own pace, browse more than 35 vendors, enjoy delicious food trucks, attend speaker presentations and panels, meet investigators, hear incredible stories, and dive into the worlds of hauntings, cryptids, UFOs, and the unexplained. Whether you're a seasoned ghost hunter or just curious about the mysteries that surround us, there's something for everyone at the West Kentucky Paranormal Expo. Tickets are on sale now. For more information, visit West Kentucky Paranormal Expo on Facebook and get ready for one of the most exciting paranormal events of the year. We'll see you in Mayfield on September 26th. Welcome back to Southern Ghost Stories. I'm the American historian, Allen Sircy. On Sunday afternoon, January 4th, 1903, Louis Mott sat drinking inside the building that had once housed his steam laundry in Missoula, Montana. For years, Mott had operated the Troy Laundry at 324 West 1st Street, but by the beginning of 1903, his life was unraveling. He was 50 years old, a former businessman who had once done well enough to employ others and support a family. But alcohol had become a constant presence in his life. And according to those who knew him, his drinking was getting worse. There were also reports that Mott had been using drugs. His temper had become unpredictable. He liked to shoot his guns, and if people around him knew that when Louis Mott was drinking, violence was never far away. Mott lived above the old laundry with his wife, Leah, and their two young daughters, Alice and Ethel, and members of the extended family. Louis and Leah had been married for about 16 years and had lived in Missoula for roughly 14 of them. Leah was not Louis's first wife, and Mott had two sons, Jack and Henry, from an earlier marriage. The couple's daughters were still children, one around 9 and the other about 8. Whatever happiness had once existed inside the Mott home had been steadily destroyed by Louis's drinking. The laundry itself had recently been sold, and the sale had become another source of bitterness between husband and wife. Leah had reportedly taken a greater role in the business because of Louis's drunkenness. Louis resented it. He began drinking even heavier and treating Leah worse than usual. On a Sunday afternoon, Louis filled himself with liquor. At some point, he and Leah began arguing in the parlor. What they said to one another was not recorded, but Leah apparently became afraid of her husband. She left the parlor and moved down the hallway toward the kitchen. Louis remained behind. Then he called for his daughters. Louis told the two little girls to come into the parlor. He said he wanted to play cards with them. Alice and Ethel left the kitchen and went to see their father. Whether Louis actually played cards with the girls or merely used the promise to lure them away, no one really knows. But once the children were removed from the kitchen, Louis picked up a revolver. Leah was now alone near the back of the building. Louis walked down the hall with a gun in his hand. Mrs. Lockhart, the family's cook, was in the kitchen and later became the most important eyewitness to what happened next. She'd seen Leah helping with the dishes only minutes earlier. According to Miss Lockhart, Leah said nothing about her husband as she worked, but Louis appeared in the hallway. And the moment Leah saw him, she moved away. She stepped through the kitchen door and toward the outside back stairway. Louis followed. Leah reached the steps. Her husband stopped inside the building. Between them was a door containing panes of glass. Louis raised the revolver. He fired through the window. The first bullet smashed through the glass and struck Leah. Louis fired again and again. 5 shots were discharged in rapid succession, the explosions echoing through the neighborhood. 4 bullets struck Leah Mott. One entered her back and damaged her spine. Another passed through her body into the abdomen cavity. A third entered the near right side of her spine. A fourth struck her arm below the elbow. Leah somehow remained on her feet. She walked to the bottom of the back stairs. Then she collapsed onto the final step. Inside, Miss Lockhart heard the gunfire and rushed into the hallway. She saw Louis standing with a revolver still in his hand. Smoke rose from the weapon. For a moment, Miss Lockhart believed Mott might turn the gun on himself. She later recalled that he appeared to be trying to shoot himself. Miss Lockhart rushed him and grabbed the revolver, and Louis didn't fire again. She took the literal smoking gun from his hand and hurried to Leah, who was lying near the bottom of the stairs. By then, the shots had drawn attention throughout the neighborhood. People began gathering outside the old laundry. Officer Wilson and Detective Hogan were near the depot when they noticed the commotion, and they hurried toward the building. Hogan described it as the lighter and faster of the 2 men arrived first. He found Louis Mott in a back room. Mott was placed under arrest. Now, the scene was chaotic. Leah was still alive. Her children were nearby. A crowd was forming outside, yet Louis reportedly showed little outward emotion. He was drunk and calmly smoked a long-stemmed pipe while officers secured him. Detective Hogan took possession of the revolver Miss Lockhart had removed from Mott's hand and began walking the prisoner toward the jail. Halfway there, Louis saw an acquaintance. Mott greeted the man and made a remarkable statement. Quote unquote, "I guess I've done it this time." He continued, saying he had been too intoxicated to fully understand any connected story of the tragedy. Later at the jail, Mott spoke even more openly. When asked about what had happened, he reportedly said, "I tried to finish the job, but the revolver wouldn't go. I'm a has-been, and I'm ready for anything they want to do with me. Hang me, or anything. I don't care." Louis Mott was locked in an upper cell. Meanwhile, doctors were fighting to save his wife. Dr. Buckley examined Leah and immediately recognized the seriousness of her wounds. Preparations were made to move her to the Sisters' Hospital. Dr. Buckley and Dr. McCullough performed surgery, probing for the bullets and attempting to repair the damage. The wounds were devastating. One bullet had entered near the lumbar vertebra and traveled toward the spinal column. Another had passed through the abdominal cavity and injured the kidney. The damage was extensive. Before Leah was taken into surgery, County Attorney Hall and a police officer named Hayes arrived. They wanted a statement. Leah was told that her condition was serious, and she agreed to speak, and her account was taken down in full. Leah said Louis had been drinking heavily. She described leaving him in the parlor and going toward the kitchen. She believed he called the children away before following her, and then as she stood outside the door on the little platform near the stairs, Louis appeared inside and fired through the glass. At first, Leah did not understand she'd been hit. Then the third bullet struck. She realized what was happening. Leah turned. She started down the stairs and collapsed at the bottom. Doctors continued working, but the damage was too severe. Leah Mott survived the shooting for only a few hours. At 9:25 that night, she died at the Sisters' Hospital. Louis Mott had murdered his wife. So tonight we're traveling to Missoula, Montana, at the beginning of the 20th century for a story that starts with a drunken husband, a revolver, and a woman desperately trying to escape down a back stairway. But this story would eventually become something much stranger, because before Louis Mott went to the gallows, he made a promise. He claimed he could prove there was life after death, and he told a United States Congressman exactly when his ghost would appear. When the appointed night fully arrived, a small group gathered in Washington and waited for a dead murderer to keep his word. The killing of Leah Mott caused immediate outrage in Missoula. This had not been a mysterious death committed in some isolated location. Leah had been shot in her own home. A witness had seen the moments surrounding the attack. Her husband had been arrested with little question about who fired the gun. Louis had made statements after the shooting that seemed to acknowledge what he had done, and Leah herself had survived long enough to describe the attack. The question was not whether Louis Mott had fired the revolver. The question was what punishment he would face. Mott's attorneys attempted to build their defense around his mental condition and his prolonged use of alcohol and drugs. Louis had been drinking heavily for months. His behavior had become erratic, and there were suggestions that in his mind it had been afflicted by his addictions. The defense argued that Mott had not acted with deliberate premeditation required for first-degree murder. They wanted the jury to believe that the killing had occurred during a sudden, drunken fit of rage. The prosecution saw deliberate actions. Louis and Leah argued. Leah left the room. Louis called his daughters away from their mother. He used the promise of a card game to bring the children into the parlor. Then he took his revolver, followed Leah down the hallway, and fired through a glass door as he tried to get away. The details mattered. If Mott had simply exploded into a moment of uncontrollable rage, why did he call the children away? Why had he waited until Leah was separated from him? Why had he followed her through the building with a loaded gun? The prosecution argued that Louis' actions showed purpose. He had created an opportunity to confront Leah alone. The case eventually went before a jury. Mott was represented by an experienced attorney who fought aggressively for his life. The defense challenged the prosecution's case and argued that outside influence had poisoned the public opinion against their client. They claimed the atmosphere surrounding the murder made it nearly impossible for Mott to get a fair trial. The judge carefully instructed the jury on the different degrees of homicide. The jurors were told that first-degree murder required malice and premeditation. Malice did not necessarily mean a long-standing hatred. Under the law, it could include a deliberate act that showed a disregard for human life. The jury could find Mott guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, or acquit him entirely. The jurors left the courtroom, and they remained out for roughly 3 hours. At one point, they returned with a question. One juror apparently had doubts about the responsibility of Mott and wanted the court to know whether a verdict could be returned with a plea for mercy attached. The judge instructed the jury that mercy could not influence its determination. Their responsibility was to examine the evidence and return a verdict based upon the law. The jury again went back to deliberate. On the first ballot, 11 jurors favored murder in the first degree. One even favored manslaughter. The discussion continued. Eventually, after a while, all 12 finally agreed. Louis Mott was guilty of murder in first degree. So the verdict carried the possibility everyone in the courtroom understood. Death. Mott's attorneys immediately began fighting to save him. They sought a new trial and argued that the jury had been influenced by matters outside the courtroom. The defense claimed some jurors had been exposed to information before hearing the case and that new evidence existed that might change the outcome. Affidavits were collected, motions were filed. The attorneys argued that Mott had not received a fair trial, and the court rejected the motion. The case was appealed to the Montana Supreme Court, and that appeal was also denied. Mott's legal options were disappearing. He had been sentenced to hang. The execution was scheduled for March 18th, 1904. Inside the Missoula County Jail, Louis Mott began the long wait for death. For months, he lived knowing that unless a court or the governor intervened, a rope would eventually be placed around his neck. And according to those who observed him, the experience slowly changed him. The drunken, violent man who had fired through the kitchen door seemed to disappear. Jailers described a prisoner who had become quieter and increasingly aware of the consequences of his actions. Mott told people that after the shooting and his arrest, his mind eventually cleared, and when it did, he understood what he had done. He had killed Leah. He had taken the mother of his children. He had left Alice and Ethel without their mother and was now preparing to leave them without their father. Mott became deeply remorseful. He said that if he had known the result of his actions, he would have never have allowed himself to reach that condition. He blamed alcohol and drugs for helping create the state of mind in which he killed his wife. But the law didn't consider voluntary intoxication a reason to excuse the murder. The condemned man still wanted to live. Mott's attorneys made a second appeal for clemency. Friends and supporters gathered affidavits and presented them to Governor Joseph Toole. Judge Woody and attorneys traveled to Helena to argue on Mott's behalf. They wanted the death sentence commuted to life in prison, and the governor reviewed the case. Then he refused. Mott's attorneys tried again. Governor Toole again declined to interfere. Louis Mott was told his final hope had disappeared. He received the news inside his cell. Those present expected anger or panic. Instead, Mott appeared to be calm. He sent a message to County Attorney Hall, the man who had prosecuted him, and asked Hall to come visit the jail. And Hall arrived approximately 5:30 in the afternoon. Mott greeted him cordially. The condemned man said he knew he was going to die. He told Hall that he had carried no hatred towards him. Mott believed the county attorney had treated him fairly and had simply performed his duty in prosecuting the case. Then Louis Mott extended his hand. The prosecutor shook it. The two men spoke for nearly 15 minutes. When Hall left the jail, Mott returned to his cell. But Louis had not completely surrendered his efforts to save his life. In a final, desperate letter to Governor Toole, Mott made an extraordinary offer. He asked the governor to spare him for the sake of his children. If the death sentence was commuted, Mott promised to take his own life. He would kill himself privately, he said, if only the governor would remove the public disgrace of an execution from his daughters. Governor Toole refused. In his response, the governor wrote that Mott's concern for his children was understandable, but hardly unique among condemned men. The real punishment of the crime, Toole observed, often fell hardest upon the innocent. Mott's daughters had already lost their mother. Now they were going to lose their father. The governor also pointed out an obvious legal problem with Mott's offer. Helping or encouraging another person to commit suicide was itself a felony. Governor Toole would not become a part of Mott's proposed arrangement. He ended his letter by recommending that Louis turn to the ministers who had been visiting him in jail and seek whatever spiritual comfort they could provide. May God in his infinite power and mercy save your soul, he wrote. The execution would proceed. By March 17th, the gallows had been completed inside a high stockade near the jail. The walls were tall enough to prevent people in the surrounding buildings from seeing what happened inside. The scaffold stood in the shadow of the jail wall. A small enclosure had been built to conceal the executioner. The machine was painted black. Deputies and workmen tested the gallows with a bag of sand. It worked perfectly, and word spread around Missoula. Hundreds of curious people visited the stockade before the execution. Men and women asked deputies how the machine worked. Some examined the beams, ropes, sticks, and bolts. There was a morbid fascination surrounding the coming death. And Louis Mott knew the gallows were ready. Mott spent much of his final afternoon receiving visitors. He appeared remarkably calm for a man who could measure the remainder of his life in hours. At 5 o'clock, he was eating dinner when a whistle sounded somewhere outside the jail. Louis heard it and immediately understood what it meant. Well, he said, I have 13 hours to live yet. There is no dramatic breakdown. He simply returned to his meal and continued talking with those who had come to see him. Several visitors remained with Mott during the evening. He talked about ordinary things and even spent time around the small camp stove in his cell. At one point, he tore pages from an old magazine and watched them burn. The flames reminded him of camping. Mott commented that if he had better paper and a little oil, the fire would resemble one of the campfires he had known before his arrest. It was an oddly normal conversation to take place in a death cell. Beyond the jail walls, men were preparing a rope. Inside, Louis Mott was remembering nights spent beside a fire. The religious question continued to trouble him. For much of his time in jail, Mott had not committed himself firmly to any particular faith. Christian visitors had worked with him for weeks, attempting to prepare him for death. Two Sisters of Charity regularly came by the jail. Father Macklin also visited. At times, Mott appeared to lean towards Catholicism, but he remained uncertain almost until his final hours. On the afternoon before the execution, he reportedly announced that he would not be baptized. Later that night, however, Father Macklin returned and remained with him for some time. Whatever he said between the priest and the condemned man was largely private, but by the following morning, Mott's religious uncertainty had shifted again. The jail remained under constant guard. Louis had been watched continuously for months. Since Christmas, deputies had taken shifts so that someone was always watching him. Officials knew Mott had once attempted to turn the revolver on himself after shooting Leah, and they were not willing to risk suicide now. His strange offer to the governor had only reinforced their concern. Mott had promised to kill himself if his sentence was commuted. The governor refused, and the sheriff intended to make sure the sentence of the court was carried out exactly as ordered. Sheriff Thompson had his own difficult responsibility. He had spent months supervising Mott's confinement and had become familiar with the condemned man. There was no pleasure in what he was about to do. Yet the sheriff believed his duty was clear. Louis Mott had been convicted of murder, and the courts had reviewed the case. The governor didn't intervene, and the sheriff was now responsible for carrying out the law. But there was one unusual decision concerning the execution. Sheriff Thompson refused to cater to what he considered morbid curiosity. He did not want people collecting pieces of the gallows or carrying away the rope as souvenirs. The rope used to hang Louis Mott was to be burned immediately after the execution. Nothing connected to the hanging was to leave the stockade in the pockets of spectators. The night passed. Shortly before dawn, the preparations began inside the jail. Louis Mott was given breakfast. Sheriff Thompson sent him a meal of raw oysters on ice, along with other food. Mott ate. Two Sisters of Charity visited his cell around 5 o'clock in the morning and remained with him approximately 20 minutes. He made no effort to eat again afterward. He had slept during the night, although his rest had apparently become broken at times. Those watching him saw no obvious signs of panic. Then the hour approached. The execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock. The gallows stood outside a temporary stockade approximately 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. The walls were around 15 feet high, preventing anyone in the surrounding buildings from looking inside. The scaffold occupied one end of the enclosure. Near the other end was a small space for the executioner, hidden from the condemned man and most of the witnesses. The mechanism itself had been carefully designed so the person who released the trap would remain concealed. The gallows used a system of weights and ropes. A heavy iron weight was connected to the mechanism holding the trap in place. The executioner would cut a rope. The weight would fall. The mechanism would release. The trap beneath Mott's feet would open. Everything had been tested. At 6 o'clock, Sheriff Thompson entered Louis Mott's cell. The sheriff read the death warrant. Mott listened. Then he prepared to walk. Unlike many condemned prisoners, Louis was not strapped before leaving the cell. His arms were free. His legs were not bound. He walked toward the gallows under his own power. At 6:05 in the morning, Louis Mott entered the stockade. Around 30 people had been invited to witness the execution. The small group stood inside the enclosure waiting. Some were officials. Others had known Mott when he was a respected citizen of Missoula. There were men in the crowd who remembered him as a businessman and a family man before alcohol and drugs consumed his life. For them, the man approaching the scaffold was not simply a convicted murderer. They had known a different Louis Mott. Mott walked firmly. He did not have to be supported. Father Macklin walked with him. Louis stepped onto the platform and stood beneath the rope. For a moment he looked around. Those watching saw no obvious fear. Mott and the sheriff exchanged a few words. Louis had already said that he carried no hatred toward the officials involved in his death. He understood Sheriff Thompson was performing his duty. He had said the same thing about County Attorney Hall, the man who prosecuted him. Now there was nothing left to discuss. Louis Mott began to pray. Almighty God, into thy hands I now resign my spirit. The words carried through the stockade. The sheriff and deputies moved into position. Mott was placed directly over the trap. The rope was lowered around his neck. His arms and legs were secured. The noose was adjusted. Mott continued to pray. His voice remained clear. Those standing near the scaffold could hear every single word. Then the black cap was placed over his head. Louis Mott disappeared beneath the dark cloth. The sheriff stepped away. At 6:08 in the morning, the mechanism was released. The trap fell. Louis Mott dropped through the scaffold. The rope snapped tight. The fall broke his neck. There was no prolonged struggle, no desperate movement behind the gallows. According to those present, death appeared almost instantly. The body hung suspended while physicians approached and monitored him. The rope remained tight around his neck as the minutes passed. At approximately 6:13, Dr. Buckley Brown and McCullough examined the body. They pronounced Louis dead. The man who had murdered his wife 14 months earlier had paid the penalty ordered by the court. The body was lowered. Officials prepared the remains for burial. Louis had made special requests concerning his funeral. He didn't want to be buried in the clothing provided by the county. He wanted his own clothes. He also asked to be buried in Missoula, rather than having his body sent somewhere else. Before his death, Mott had dictated a brief message concerning his possessions. "I've only got two things left in the world, my hat and my boots. You take my hat, give my boots to Billy Wilson." Those few belongings were among the final pieces of a life that had once included a business, a wife, and children. The funeral was arranged for the following morning. Mott was to be buried in Missoula Valley Cemetery. His uncle Lamone Mott claimed the body and agreed to pay the funeral expenses. There would be no elaborate public spectacle. Mott had specifically asked for a quiet burial that would attract as little attention as possible. After the executions, Sheriff Thompson ordered the rope destroyed. It was burned, the gallows were left behind, and Louis was buried. Under regular circumstances, that would have been the end of the story. A man had murdered his wife, been convicted by a jury, and executed by the state of Montana. Leah Mott was dead. Louis Mott was dead. Their daughters had lost both parents in a little more than a year. But Louis made a promise before he died. He intended to prove there was life after death. Representative Joseph Dixon was a Montana congressman serving in Washington. Dixon knew about Mott's approaching execution, and at some point before the hanging, Louis made an unusual declaration. After his death, Mott said he would visit Dixon. This was not a vague promise to haunt the jail or appear near his grave. Louis selected a person. He selected a place. And apparently he selected a time, 10 o'clock. The execution took place on Friday morning. By Sunday night, the congressman was ready. Several friends gathered with him in Washington. The group was not holding a traditional seance. There was no medium seated at some table. No one joined hands in a darkened room. There were no spirit trumpets, Ouija boards, or attempt to summon Louis Mott. They just simply waited. The gathering was jokingly described as a reception for a ghost. Perhaps it was the first reception ever held in Washington in honor of a dead murderer. As 10 o'clock approached, Dixon and his friends talked among themselves. Interestingly, they did not spend the evening telling ghost stories. Instead, they traded stories about political contests in the far west. The men talked and waited. Then 10 o'clock arrived, at the appointed hour. If Louis Mott had been telling the truth, his ghost was due. The room remained quiet. Nothing happened. No footsteps approached. No door opened. No pale figure appeared. Louis Mott didn't keep his appointment. Dixon and his friends continued to wait. Perhaps Louis was late. Even the congressman found humor in the situation. Dixon pointed out there was a time difference between Washington and Montana. Maybe Mott intended to appear at 10 o'clock Montana time. If that was the case, the ghost would not arrive in Washington until around 1 in the morning. The guests eventually left, but Dixon remained. He kept watch. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. Still nothing. No Louis Mott. The murderer who had promised to prove life after death had failed to appear. The story quickly became a source of amusement. Louis Mott's ghost had missed the appointment. The dead man who claimed he would travel from Montana to Washington had apparently been unable or unwilling to keep his word. But there's something strangely haunting about the story, even without an apparition. Louis spent the final moments of his life thinking about death. He knew the exact day he was going to die. During his final hours, he could calculate how much time was left. At 5 in the afternoon, he heard that whistle and announced he had 13 hours left. He watched the hours disappear and talked about the campfires. He received visitors. He prayed. Then at 6 in the morning, he walked beneath that rope. Maybe Louis' promise to Dixon was nothing more than bravado. Maybe a condemned man facing oblivion needed to believe that something waited beyond the scaffold. Maybe he truly believed he could return. Or perhaps Louis Mott didn't just keep his promise. Just not in the way Joseph Dixon expected. Dixon and his friends waited for a figure to walk into the room. They expected a visible ghost, something unmistakable that would prove Louis Mott had survived death. But if the dead do return, perhaps they don't follow clocks. Perhaps they don't understand appointments, and perhaps the distance between a grave in Missoula and a ruin in Washington can't be crossed simply because a condemned man promised it could. What we know is Joseph Dixon waited. His friends waited. 10 o'clock came and went, then midnight, then 1 in the morning. And somewhere in Montana, Louis Mott lay beneath the ground in Missoula Valley Cemetery. The throat that killed him had been burned. The gallows were empty. Leah Mott had been dead for more than a year. And the ghost never came. So make sure you guys head over to Amazon, pick up the latest book, Pistols at Red River, the Andrew Jackson Doolin story. It's 1806, man, wild time to be alive. You could just settle your affairs with a pistol. Anyway, the book is available on Kindle. If you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. And speaking of books, tomorrow I'm making a special announcement. I have 3 new books coming out pretty soon, and I'm going to spill the beans on Thursday. So check back tomorrow. I've been working behind the scenes on these books for a while, and I'm finally excited to release them out into the world. And also, please make sure you leave a review and subscribe to the show. It really helps more folks find the podcast. And we're trying to get 150 Apple Podcast reviews before October. Please help me out and leave a review. It takes less than a minute. Have you guys been to Monster City Madhouse yet? MonsterCityMadhouse.com. The new shirt, man, it's a whole lot of fun. And I may or may not have had a hand in its creation. It's up for debate, but I really did. The greatest cryptid tag team of all time has arrived. Straight from the deepest forest of cryptomania comes the Monster Powers, featuring the Yeti and the Bigfoot and an over-the-top tribute to classic 1980s wrestling, monster magazines, and larger-than-life personalities. Packed with colorful retro artwork, outrageous promos, championship gold, and enough cryptid power to shake the woods, this exclusive Monster City Madhouse design is perfect for wrestling fans, cryptid hunters, horror lovers, and anyone who appreciates old-school cartoon mayhem, brother. Whether you're tracking Bigfoot, searching for the Yeti, or just ready to watch the mega monsters run wild, this shirt was made to stand out. And you can use promo code SAVE10 to get 10% off your order. That's right, promo code SAVE10 gets you 10% off at MonsterCityMadhouse.com. So make sure you're following Southern Ghost Stories on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to send in questions for a future Q&A show, send those to me at southernghoststories@gmail.com. So thanks for listening to Southern Ghost Stories. I'm Allen Sircy, the American Historian, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for details on the new books. If you love ghost stories, folklore, and all things mysterious, you need to make a trip to Haunted in downtown Tullahoma, Tennessee. Just a short drive from Nashville, this family-owned Gothic shop is filled with the strange, unusual, and downright fascinating. This isn't a big box store full of mass-produced decorations. Haunted specializes in handmade curiosities, Gothic decor, metaphysical supplies, green witchcraft essentials, and unique pieces created by independent artists. Whether you're decorating or just looking for something you won't find anywhere else, Haunted is worth the trip. Visit them on 125 West Lincoln Street in Tullahoma, or shop online at hauntedstore.net. That's right, hauntedstore.net. Haunted, curated for the strange and unusual. Monster City Madhouse, a year-round online store full of Halloween and classic horror shirts, with an emphasis on the vintage look. Use code SAVE10 for 10% off your order. MonsterCityMadhouse.com. Free shipping and financing's available.